Most people can tell you the exact day the Second World War began. September 1st, 1939. German tanks crossing the Polish border at dawn. It is the most documented date in modern history, printed in every textbook, opening every documentary ever made about the war. And as an explanation for the deadliest catastrophe humanity has ever produced, it is almost useless. Because by September of 1939, the war had been inevitable for years. Not likely, not looming, inevitable, locked in, scheduled, and largely paid for. The tanks were just the delivery of a product that had been ordered, financed, and manufactured over 2 decades. And if you want to know when the order was actually placed, you don't look at a border crossing in Poland. You look at a room full of mirrors in France, 20 years earlier. June 28, 1919. The Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles. Under 6,000 square feet of painted ceiling, 2 German delegates are led to a small table to sign the treaty that ends the First World War. They are given no chance to negotiate. The terms have been decided without them. Outside, cannons fire in celebration, and the crowds in Paris believe they are watching the birth of a lasting peace. One man in the Allied camp knew better. Marshal Ferdinand Foch, the supreme commander of the Allied armies, the most decorated soldier in France, read the finished treaty and refused to celebrate. His verdict was one sentence: "This is not peace. It is an armistice for 20 years." Now, people quote that line all the time as a lucky guess. It was not a guess. It was a calculation. Count forward from that signature, 20 years and 65 days, and you arrive at September 1st, 1939. And Foch wasn't even the first to walk away from that table. 3 weeks before the ceremony, a 36-year-old official of the British Treasury packed his papers, resigned his post at the peace conference, and went home to write. His name was John Maynard Keynes, and he had spent months watching the victors design the economic terms of the peace. What he saw horrified him. That winter, he published a short, furious book called The Economic Consequences of the Peace. It sold 100,000 copies in 6 months, was translated into a dozen languages, and made him the most famous economist alive. In it, he predicted, in print in 1919, that the treaty would impoverish Central Europe, radicalize its politics, and produce another war. His warning had the rhythm of a curse. If we aim deliberately at the impoverishment of Central Europe, vengeance, I dare predict, will not limp. Nobody in power listened. And this video is the story of what happened because they didn't. But I want to be precise about what kind of story this is, because it is not the one you were taught. The version in the textbooks runs on personalities: a vengeful treaty, a humiliated nation, a madman with a microphone. All of that is real. None of it explains the timing, the speed, or the money. So we are going to follow the money instead. This story runs through a fictional bond that politicians invented so they could lie to their own voters. Through American widows and pension funds who, without knowing it, paid Germany's reparations for most of a decade. Through a banker nicknamed the Old Wizard, who armed the Third Reich with 12 billion marks that did not officially exist. Through the Bank of England, which transferred a conquered country's gold to Berlin 4 months before the shooting started. And through the most uncomfortable fact of all. Almost nobody in this chain of decisions was stupid, and almost nobody was insane. They were rational. They were profitable. That is exactly why it happened. One sentence before we start, because this subject demands it. Nothing in this video excuses or diminishes the crimes of the Nazi regime. The point is to understand the machine that made those crimes possible, because machines can be rebuilt. Now let's go back to Paris. The treaty the Germans signed that June contained 440 articles, but the entire 20-year fuse is packed into one of them. Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. Germany and her allies accept responsibility for causing all the loss and damage of the war. To the Allied lawyers who drafted it, this was a technicality, the legal foundation required before you could bill someone. To every German who read it, across every political party from the communists to the monarchists, it was a national humiliation, signed under blockade and duress. And here is the detail that matters. The bill itself wasn't even in the treaty. The victors couldn't agree on a number in 1919, so they created a reparation commission and gave it 2 years. In May of 1921, the commission delivered its figure, 132 billion gold marks, roughly $33 billion, close to 3 times Germany's entire annual economic output. The equivalent burden today would be measured in the tens of trillions. Except that number was a lie, and not a German lie, an Allied one. Buried in the London schedule of payments was a piece of financial theater that almost nobody outside the negotiating rooms understood. The 132 billion was split into 3 classes of bonds, A bonds and B bonds, totaling 50 billion gold marks. Those were real, scheduled, and enforceable. And then C bonds, 82 billion gold marks that would only come due at some undefined future date, under conditions that everyone at the table privately understood would never arrive. The C bonds existed for one audience only: voters. French and Belgian politicians had spent 2 years promising their shattered electorates that Germany would pay for everything. France had buried 1.4 million men and had her richest industrial provinces bombed into mud, and no politician could survive telling the truth about what was collectible. So they invented a number for the newspapers and a smaller number for the bankers. Think about what that means. The entire post-war financial order was founded on a figure that its own authors knew was fiction. The Germans were handed a bill designed to enrage them, most of which was never meant to be collected. Keynes had a name for this kind of settlement. He called it a Carthaginian peace, vengeance dressed up as accounting, a peace designed to grind the loser into the dirt, the way Rome ground Carthage. But the deeper problem, the one that would take 2 decades to detonate, was subtler. The treaty was severe enough to poison German politics forever, and too weakly enforced to actually keep Germany down. It enraged the debtor and never disarmed him. Historians would spend the next century arguing about whether Versailles was too harsh or too lenient. And we'll come back to that fight, because the real answer is stranger than either camp admits. For the first 18 months, Germany paid in cash, in coal, in chemicals, in timber, and then, increasingly, it didn't. Whether Germany couldn't pay or wouldn't pay is one of the oldest arguments in economic history, and the honest answer is both, on alternating days. But in December of 1922, the Reparation Commission formally declared Germany in default. And what exactly was the default that changed world history? Telegraph poles. Germany had fallen behind on deliveries of timber, about 100,000 telegraph poles, and on coal shipments. On that pretext, in January of 1923, French and Belgian troops marched into the Ruhr Valley, the dense knot of mines and steelworks that produced roughly 4/5 of Germany's coal and steel. The plan was simple. If Germany won't send the coal, we'll take the mines. 60,000 troops, eventually more, occupying the industrial heart of a country in peacetime, over lumber. Berlin could not fight back. The treaty had cut its army to 100,000 men. So the German government reached for the only weapon it had left, and it was a weapon pointed at its own head. It ordered the Ruhr's workers to stop working. Passive resistance. 2 million miners and steelworkers walked off the job, and the German state promised to keep paying their wages. With what? The government's budget was already a ruin. So it printed. And printed. What happened next is the part of this story everyone has heard, usually as a kind of dark comedy. By November of 1923, $1 bought 4.2 trillion marks. A loaf of bread cost 200 billion. Workers were paid twice a day and given half-hour breaks to sprint to the shops before the afternoon price increase. There's a story from that autumn of a man who hauled his wages home in a wheelbarrow, left it outside a shop for a minute, and came back to find the money dumped on the pavement. The thieves had taken the wheelbarrow. Restaurants stopped printing prices. Insurance policies that families had funded for 30 years paid out sums that wouldn't buy a newspaper. Now here is where I have to stop and demolish the single most repeated error in the popular memory of the 20th century. The hyperinflation did not put Hitler in power. Check the dates. Hitler's response to the chaos of 1923 was the beer hall putsch that November, a coup attempt so amateurish it collapsed in 16 hours and put him in prison. The currency was stabilized within months. The economy recovered, and in the national elections of 1928, 5 years after the wheelbarrows, the Nazi Party polled 2.6% of the vote. 2.6. A fringe of cranks and brawlers, shrinking, ignored. Whatever put that party into the chancellery, it was not the printing press of 1923. But the hyperinflation did do something, and it was quieter and more permanent than a coup. It vaporized the savings of the German middle class, the teachers, engineers, pensioners, the people whose entire identity was built on prudence. War bonds they had bought out of patriotism, worthless. A lifetime of deposits, worthless. These were the most rule-following people in Europe, and they learned in a single year that following the rules was for suckers, that the system protects nobody, that respectability is a currency that can also hit zero. The fuse was soaked in 1923. The match came 7 years later, and here's the twist. The match was made of the opposite material. Not inflation. We'll get there. The man who stopped the hyperinflation deserves an introduction, because he is about to become the most important character in this story. In November 1923, a 50-something banker with a stiff collar, a talent for cigars, and an ego that filled rooms was appointed Germany's currency commissioner. His name was Hjalmar Schacht. His fix was, on paper, ridiculous. He introduced a new currency, the Rentenmark, and declared it was backed by a mortgage on all of Germany's agricultural land and industrial plant. Think about that for a moment. You cannot redeem a banknote for a slice of a farm in Bavaria. The backing was legally real and practically meaningless. It was a confidence trick, and it worked. Because after 1923, what Germany had run out of was not gold, but belief. And Schacht understood that money is belief with a serial number. Within weeks, the old mark was swept away, prices held, and Schacht was rewarded with the presidency of the Reichsbank. The press called him the Old Wizard. Remember the nickname, and remember what his first great trick was: conjuring stability out of an asset nobody could ever collect. His second great trick will use the same method to opposite ends. With the currency saved, the reparations problem remained. Germany still owed a mountain it would not climb. So in 1924, the Americans stepped in, and this is where the story stops being a European tragedy and becomes a global machine. A committee led by the Chicago banker Charles Dawes restructured the payments. Lighter annuities, a reorganized Reichsbank, and, the engine of the whole thing, an enormous American loan to Germany to prime the pump. When the Dawes loan was floated on Wall Street in October 1924, it was oversubscribed within hours. Ordinary Americans, banks, insurance companies, pension funds, widows looking for a safe 7%, lined up to lend Germany money, and they kept lining up for 6 years. Look at the circuit this created, because it is one of the strangest financial structures ever built. American investors lend to Germany. Germany uses the dollars to pay reparations to France and Britain. France and Britain use the reparations to pay their war debts back to America, $10 billion of them. And American banks, having received the war debt payments, lend to Germany again, collecting fees and commissions on every rotation of the wheel. Money was flowing in a circle across the Atlantic, and at every station, someone booked a profit and called it prosperity. Here is the number that gives the game away. Between 1924 and 1930, Germany borrowed roughly 28 billion marks from abroad and paid out roughly 10 to 11 billion in reparations. Germany was not paying reparations. America was, through Germany, while Germany pocketed the difference. German cities went on a borrowing spree that would make a modern municipal treasurer blush. Opera houses, swimming pools, stadiums, planetariums, all built on short-term American credit. Gustav Stresemann, Germany's foreign minister and the architect of this borrowed calm, said it plainly: Germany is dancing on a volcano. If the short-term credits are called in, a large section of our economy would collapse. Even the officials in charge knew the machine was mad. In 1929, they tried to tidy it up one last time with the Young Plan, which stretched Germany's payments out on a gentler schedule. Do you want to know the date of the final scheduled installment? 1988. In 1929, serious men in suits sat in a conference room and scheduled a payment for 1988, as if the world were a metronome. The world had other plans. That same October, Wall Street crashed. But, and this is another place where the standard story misleads you, the crash was not the moment the money stopped. American lending to Germany had already dried up in 1928, a year earlier, because the Wall Street bubble was offering better returns at home. Why lend to Dusseldorf at 7% when General Motors stock doubles in a year? The circle of money had already stopped spinning. The crash just made sure it would never spin again. And every American short-term credit sitting in a German bank now had a nervous owner who wanted it back. The unraveling, when it came, started in neither Berlin nor New York. It started in Vienna. In May 1931, Austria's largest bank, the Kreditanstalt, a house so old and so grand it was practically furniture, announced losses that wiped out its capital. The news detonated a continent-wide bank run because everyone suddenly asked the question that kills all banking systems. Who else is holding garbage? By July, the panic reached Germany. On July 13, 1931, the Dänat Bank, one of Germany's big four, shut its doors, and the government declared a bank holiday, freezing every account in the country. Herbert Hoover scrambled a one-year moratorium on reparations and war debts, which was the right idea, a decade too late. And buried in the wreckage of that summer is a detail that almost no documentary ever mentions and that you need to hold on to for the rest of this video: the standstill agreements. British banks, the great names of the City of London, had roughly £70 million of short-term credits trapped inside frozen Germany. Rather than write them off, they agreed to leave them there, rolling over, waiting for a healthier Germany that could one day pay them back. From the summer of 1931 onward, the City of London had a direct financial interest in Germany's solvency. Not its democracy, its solvency. File that away, it comes back in 1938. Meanwhile, the German government did to the Depression exactly the wrong thing, for reasons that made perfect sense to everyone involved, which is the theme of this entire story. Chancellor Heinrich Brüning cut spending, cut wages, cut pensions, raised taxes, and defended the currency like a fortress. Why? Two reasons. First, the trauma. After 1923, printing money was politically unthinkable in Germany. Deflation was the only respectable disease. Second, strategy. Brüning wanted to demonstrate to the Allies, ledger in hand, that Germany was too broke to pay reparations, and every point of misery was a negotiating exhibit. He got his proof. Unemployment reached 6 million, one German worker in 3. They called him the Hunger Chancellor. And now put two charts side by side: unemployment and the Nazi vote. 1928, prosperity, 2.6%. 1930, after 1 year of austerity, 18.3%. July 1932, at the bottom of the deflation, 37.3%, the largest party in Germany. The lines climbed together, step for step. This is the fact that should be printed in every textbook, and almost never is. Hitler was not carried to power by the inflation of 1923. He was carried by the deflation of 1930 to 1932, by balanced budget orthodoxy applied to a starving country. The wheelbarrows made the middle class cynical. The austerity made them desperate. Cynical and desperate is the exact chemical formula. And here is the blackest irony in the whole timeline. In the summer of 1932, at the Lausanne Conference, the Allies finally did what Keynes had begged them to do 13 years earlier. They effectively canceled reparations. Germany would end up paying, over the entire period, only about 20 billion gold marks of the original 132. Reparations died 6 months before German democracy did. The poison had already done its work. In January 1933, the fringe candidate of 1928 was appointed Chancellor of Germany, and within weeks, he made a phone call to the old wizard. In March 1933, Hjalmar Schacht returned to the presidency of the Reichsbank and was soon running the economics ministry as well. The new regime handed him a problem with no legal solution. Germany was going to rearm massively, years ahead of what anyone abroad suspected. But rearmament was banned by the treaty. The state was broke. Foreign lenders were gone, and printing money openly would resurrect the ghost of 1923 and shatter confidence at home and abroad. So, fund the largest military buildup in history, in secret, with no money, without inflation panic. Schacht's answer was a scheme so audacious that economics textbooks still tiptoe around it. In 1933, four of Germany's industrial giants, Siemens, Krupp, Rheinmetall, and Gute Hoffnungshütte, were quietly instructed to co-found a small company called the Metallurgical Research Corporation, Mefo for short. Its combined founding capital was 1 million Reichsmarks. It had no factories, it made no products, it researched nothing. It was a name, a mailbox, and a signature. And through that mailbox, over the next 5 years, flowed 12 billion Reichsmarks of weapons contracts, 12,000 times its capital. The mechanics were elegant, the way a picked lock is elegant. An arms manufacturer delivered tanks or shells to the Wehrmacht and was paid not in cash, but in a Mefo bill, an IOU drawn on the empty company, guaranteed by the state, earning 4%, and convertible into cash at the Reichsbank whenever the holder wanted. Most holders didn't convert. The bills circulated among banks and industrialists like private money. Military spending was thereby split off from the official budget and hidden inside the paper of a firm that did not really exist. A foreign analyst studying Germany's published accounts in 1936 saw a country running manageable deficits and rebuilding roads. The Reich's true military spending, roughly half of it moving through Mefo paper in the early years, was invisible. It was the Rentenmark trick inverted. In 1923, Schacht had conjured belief to save a currency. In 1934, he conjured invisibility to build a war machine. 12 billion Reichsmarks of tanks, paid for with money that did not officially exist, issued against a company with one office. When people tell you the world failed to see German rearmament coming, be precise about why. The evidence was hidden not in bunkers, but in bookkeeping. Schacht bought the hardware, and his new plan bought the raw materials, a web of barter deals across the Balkans and South America that swapped German machinery for Yugoslav copper and Romanian oil without a dollar changing hands, pulling half a continent into Berlin's economic orbit before a shot was fired. The wizard had done everything asked of him. And then, in the late 1930s, the wizard looked at his own ledger and felt fear. The Mefo bills were coming due. The state's true debts were compounding beneath the floorboards. The economy was overheating, full employment, empty shelves, factories fighting over workers. Schacht began to warn, first privately, then formally, that the pace of rearmament would end in inflation and collapse. In January 1939, he and the entire Reichsbank Directorate signed a memorandum to Hitler, stating flatly that the currency was threatened and the spending had to stop. Hitler read it, called it mutiny, and fired him within days. The man who built the machine reached for the brake and discovered the machine had never had one. Schacht would end the war in a concentration camp, having drifted toward the resistance, and end the decade in a courtroom at Nuremberg, where he was acquitted, the only major economic figure of the Reich to walk free. History has never quite decided what he was. He financed the Third Reich, and he was among the first to see exactly where it was going. Both things are true, and they are true of this whole story. Because now we have to cross the channel and ask the question that hangs over the 1930s like smoke. Why did the winners let all of this happen? You were taught one word, appeasement. And you were taught to hear it as a synonym for cowardice, weak men in top hats, too frightened to face the dictator. But look at appeasement through the account books, and it becomes something much more uncomfortable. A policy that was, for its constituents, rational. Start with the City of London. Remember the standstill agreements? The £70 million of British money frozen inside German banks since 1931? That money was still there. A hard confrontation with Berlin, sanctions, or war meant writing it off. The most powerful financial district on earth had a standing, quantifiable interest in a Germany that stayed solvent and stayed friendly. Then look at the British Treasury. Its official doctrine, stated in cabinet papers in almost these words, was that Britain's economy was the fourth arm of defense, alongside the Army, Navy, and Air Force. Britain had watched its currency thrown off gold by the 1931 crisis, and the Treasury argued that overspending on rearmament would wreck sterling and lose a long war before it began. So Britain rearmed late and slow, on purpose, by doctrine. And who ran Britain? Neville Chamberlain, not a naive man, but a former Chancellor of the Exchequer who had personally steered the country through the 1931 crash, and who read every foreign policy question as a budget line. Appeasement was not cowardice, it was accounting, which is somehow worse. And it wasn't only London. General Motors owned Opel, which built the Blitz trucks the Wehrmacht would drive east. Ford's German subsidiary kept producing through the decade. IBM's German affiliate leased the punch card machines that made the Reich's bureaucracy, including its most monstrous departments, run on time. None of these firms set out to arm a war. They set out to keep profitable subsidiaries profitable, quarter after quarter, which is what firms do. The machine did not require villains at every station. It required only that everyone keep doing their job. If you want a single image for how deep this went, take June 1939. The Bank for International Settlements in Basel, the central bank of central banks, created, with beautiful irony, to administer reparations, instructed the Bank of England to transfer £5.6 million of gold held in London for the National Bank of Czechoslovakia into an account controlled by Germany's Reichsbank. Czechoslovakia had been invaded and dismembered in March. The gold moved anyway. 4 months before the war, the Bank of England was moving a conquered nation's gold for Berlin, and every signature on the transfer was legal. That is the point of this entire story. The machine was legal. Now run the film backward from the other side, because the German account books in the late 1930s tell a story that almost nobody in London or Paris understood at the time, and it changes the meaning of everything you know about those years. Germany in 1938 looked terrifying from the outside. Torchlight, tanks on parade, an economy at full employment. From the inside, it was a company weeks from missing payroll. Rearmament had devoured the country's foreign currency. Reserves were nearly gone. Imports of food and iron ore were being rationed against each other. The Mefo debts were compounding in the dark. The Wehrmacht's own chief of staff, Ludwig Beck, resigned in the summer of 1938, convinced that a general war would destroy Germany within months. And once you see the empty till, the pattern of German expansion snaps into a different focus. The annexation of Austria in March 1938 delivered the Austrian National Bank's reserves on the order of 90 tons of gold and foreign exchange, several times what the Reichsbank had left. The seizure of the Sudetenland, then of Prague in March 1939, delivered the Czech gold, the Skoda Works, one of the largest arms complexes in Europe, and the equipment of 30-odd divisions. Every conquest was a bailout. Germany was not expanding because it was strong. It was expanding because it was broke, and each meal made the hunger worse, because each new territory brought mouths and obligations along with its loot. At Munich in September 1938, Chamberlain wasn't facing a confident superpower. He was facing a bluff, a regime that its own generals believed could not fight, and the account books called it. He paid the bluff anyway, because his own account books told him to. By 1939, the German state was riding a bicycle that would fall over the moment it stopped. Debts that could never be honestly repaid, a currency that could not survive honest accounting, an arms economy that could not be wound down without collapse, and could not be sustained without plunder. The historian Adam Tooze, whose book The Wages of Destruction rebuilt this whole subject from the German ledgers, put the conclusion plainly. The regime went to war in 1939 understanding that time was against it, that waiting meant falling behind Britain's and France's late-starting rearmament, while the financial floorboards gave way. The war was not a departure from the German economic miracle. The war was the business model. Poland was not only an ideological target, It was the next balance sheet acquisition in a series that had started with Austria's gold. Germany did not go to war despite its economy. It went to war because of it. So what do the historians actually get wrong? Here the story folds back on itself in a way I find genuinely eerie. For decades after 1919, the educated consensus, built directly on Keynes's bestseller, was that Versailles had been monstrously harsh, that Germany's grievances were legitimate, that the debt was unpayable. That consensus had consequences. It became the moral engine of appeasement. Britain's guilt about 1919 hardened into Britain's policy by 1938. Give the aggrieved debtor what he asks, because we wronged him at the start. Then, beginning in the 1970s, historians like Sally Marks went back into the payment records and blew the old consensus apart. Germany, it turned out, had paid only a fraction, those roughly 20 billion marks, had evaded and inflated and lobbied its way around the rest, and could arguably have paid far more. The reparations, as money, were never the impossible burden of legend. So which is it? Treaty too harsh or debtor too coddled? Wrong question. The answer the ledgers give is that the number was never the problem. Versailles failed because it was severe enough to poison a nation's politics and never enforced firmly enough to contain what the poison produced. Maximum humiliation, minimum control, the worst possible combination. And the men who wrote it knew, because they had built the sea bonds, the fiction at the foundation. The historian's error, for a century, has not been about the facts. It has been about the emphasis. They tell the story as diplomacy punctuated by economics. It was economics wearing diplomacy as a costume. Stand back and look at the whole machine, end to end. French politicians inflated the bill to survive elections in a country full of graves. American investors funded the debtor because 7% was 7%. German governments borrowed to avoid taxing, then deflated to prove poverty, and handed their middle class to the radicals. British bankers propped up the regime their money was trapped inside. Treasury officials starved their own rearmament to protect a currency. Corporations kept their subsidiaries humming. Central bankers moved conquered gold because the paperwork was in order. Almost every link in the chain was forged by someone doing the reasonable thing, the professional thing, the thing their incentives paid them to do. They were not evil. They were invested. And 20 years of small, rational decisions compounded into the largest catastrophe in human history. 60 million dead, a continent burned twice, and a moral crater we still navigate around. If you take one sentence from this video, take this one. The Second World War was not an accident that interrupted the world economy. It was the world economy, arriving at its logical destination. And if you think this is safely historical, look around. The world today runs on circular debt structures no one dares unwind, where the creditor cannot afford the debtor's failure and lends him the money to pay the interest. Great powers still finance military buildups through vehicles that never appear in the headline budget. Sanctions still set countdown clocks ticking in the treasuries of the sanctioned, exactly as the account books of 1938 ticked towards September 1939. And central bankers still, on occasion, defend an abstraction while the queue outside the bank grows. The nouns change, the arithmetic doesn't. Here is a fact that should give you a slight chill. Germany made the final payment on its First World War debts, the last interest on bonds descended from those reparations, on October 3, 2010. 20 years to the day after reunification, within living memory. If you were watching videos online in 2010, the First World War was still being paid for while you scrolled. Wars end. Debts don't. Money remembers. So the next time someone tells you the Second World War began on September 1st, 1939, when the tanks crossed the Polish border, tell them about the signature of June 28, 1919. Tell them about the $82 billion in bonds that were never meant to be collected, about the American widows who paid Germany's reparations at 7%, about the empty company with one mailbox that bought 12,000 times its capital in tanks, about the frozen British millions that made peace with Berlin a fiduciary duty, and about the conquered gold that moved through London with perfect paperwork 4 months before the first bomb fell. The tanks were the last step, not the first. The war was built the way all catastrophes are built, slowly, legally, profitably, by people who were sure someone else would pay the final bill. One last scene, because history occasionally writes an ending no screenwriter would dare. July 1944. The war is still burning. In a resort hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, the Allies gather to design the financial system of the world that will exist after the victory. And the man leading the British delegation, the intellectual center of the entire conference, is John Maynard Keynes. The 36-year-old who walked out of Paris in 1919 wrote down exactly how the arithmetic of vengeance would end and was ignored for 20 years, is handed, at the end of his life, the pencil with which to redraw the system. He had less than 2 years to live, and he spent them building institutions designed around one idea: never again force a great economy into a corner it can only fight its way out of. When the war ended, the victors did not hand the losers a bill. They handed them credit, markets, and a road back. West Germany and Japan became two of the richest, most stable nations on Earth, and neither has fired a shot at its neighbors since. It took 60 million deaths to purchase the lesson that one man had written down, for the price of a book, in the winter of 1919. The signature that started the countdown and the pencil that ended it belonged to the same story all along. We just refused to read it the first time. If this changed how you see those 20 years, hit the like button. It genuinely decides whether stories like this get made. Drop a comment with your verdict. Which link in the chain was the fatal one? The fictional bonds of 1919? The Wall Street loop? The Mefo bills? Or the accounting behind appeasement? I read every one. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because we go deep into the money behind the history they simplified for you, and the next story is already coming. I'll see you in the next.